Good morning to all, and especially to Dr. Ann Bradley. I had the pleasure of collaborating and being on boards of many groups, and Ann is the most outstanding professor. For now, we do rankings about who performs the best. Dr. Bradley comes always on top. She's well trained, has a PhD in economics from George Mason University. She was well trained as a very intelligent analyst of what's going on in the world. But the way she explains economics, it makes it so clear and so understandable to most of us and to different audiences. I think I first met her when she was the key economist at the Institute for Faith, Work, and Economics. She also taught at the Institute for World Politics. Now she's academic director of the Fund for American Studies, an outstanding organization, and also a fellow with the Acton Institute. She made a lecture that hopefully most of you saw about the growing interest in democratic socialism, and she's here with us first to summarize her lecture and then open up the session for questions and answers. So Anne, it's a great privilege to have you again with us at Acton University, this time online. Anne Bradley.
Thank you so much, Alex. It's so good to be here with you. And Alex and I, as he mentioned, are friends and colleagues, and I'm privileged to be affiliated with Acton and to be with you here today. And to summarize, I think that this is a really important topic that we need to give careful consideration to, which is, what is democratic socialism? It seems to be growing in popularity, in particular, in American political circles and American, kind of pop culture circles. It seems to be trendy. It seems to be kind of resurging as a reasonable idea for how to organize economic resources, but also for, how to organize ourselves politically. And so, what I want to talk about, and if you saw the full talk, you see that I deal with these things, is kind of talking about some of the trends. And it seems to me, and I teach in the college classroom, and so I can attest from my own experience, others of you might have the same experience. It seems that there's a growing notion that a different version of socialism might be workable and actually might give us the outcomes that we want. And of course, as economists, I think we're well equipped to try to deal with those questions, because the power of the economic way of thinking is that we don't have to fight about these issues in an ideological way, which often doesn't get us anywhere, but rather we can debate about what economic system paired with what political system is going to bring the most prosperity to the most people. So we're looking at egalitarian prosperity, right? This is a new notion in human history. And so it seems that the younger age groups, at least in the United States, 18 to 24-year-olds, are growing, their affinity towards this new version of what they call democratic socialism is growing. And so I think it's really important for us to talk to them about these ideas. And one of the first things I do, again, these are just some of the highlights, but I think really important for us, is when we have these debates in the classroom or in the public square, we need to really define our terms. And so the way that I think about this is, economists are very clear when they think about allocation of scarce resources. And so socialism means the public ownership or the collective ownership of the means of production. What that means is that we don't have private property rights. We have public, kind of property, if you will. And that means that someone is going to have to be in charge of deciding the who, what, when, where, how. So it's public collective ownership. Capitalism is, guided by profit and loss. It's private ownership of the means of production. And so what that means is that individuals, often through firms, but the firms can be of varying different sizes, decide, right? So you have land, you have assets, you have human capital, you have creativity, and you're going to decide how to use those resources. Now, in capitalism, what's the guide for how you decide? Well, it's profit and loss. You have to try to figure out how to solve problems for people. You have to try to ascertain what people want and deliver it to them in the most productive and effective way. And so prices are the mechanism by which we decide how to allocate scarce resources at any given moment. And so those are the demarcations. So what is democratic socialism? I think it's this idea that you have a greater level of public ownership of the means of production, but then you do that in the context of a democracy. So I think what the younger generation is calling for is some government intervention in the economy, but with democratic constraints, because we all understand the threat of power. And so kind of I go through that in the essay, and I give a lot of different examples of ways we can measure prosperity, and of course the outcomes of different socialist experiments. But I think at the end of the day, the people who are actually advocating for democratic socialism, at least in the United States, are not really advocating for going back to, kind of what was happening in the Soviet Union or in communist China, but rather they're asking for greater level of government intervention in the economy through much higher tax rates and a larger provision of either public goods or a larger provision of wealth redistribution, again, in the attempt to get more egalitarian outcomes. I come to that as an economist and say, look, the evidence is very clear that the best way to increase the consumption possibilities of everyone is actually economic freedom, which is a system that uses the rule of law and private property rights. So it's very thoughtful about the democratic constraints that we need on power, but that it allows ordinary people through private ownership to decide what they're going to do, to experiment and to unleash that human creativity in the most productive way. So that's kind of the high level summary, right? And I think that we can get into some questions about the nuances. And Alex, I'm happy to do that now if you think it's a good time for it.
Yes, it's a good time, and Felipe Spur already has a very good questions in your chat. You mentioned about Scandinavia and how these countries have been able to maintain a high level of economic freedom, mostly because they leave part of the allocation of resources to the market. Not many have huge state companies, but they have a huge welfare state. And you say that can be the fact that they have smaller population and they have a more homogeneous population. People are prepared to go ahead and pay those enormous taxes. The question is this sustainable over time? And I want to complement Felipe's question. The fact that homogeneity seems to be an important thing. And do you expect these countries will be able to sustain the welfare state? It's almost for 100 years now. And they will become more closed, to retain their homogeneous character?
Yes, I think that's such a great question. Thank you for that question. I agree that, the question of sustainability is very important here. The question of how long these equilibrium, if you will, can last of a very large welfare state, which in a democracy that requires a political will, right? People have to be willing to engage in a 60% tax rate so that they can have, access to those resources. I'm not sure that over time, without small population, without the homogeneity, if it's scalable. And the other question really, Felipe, is, what are the alternatives? That's how economists think about these things. And I think even the best performers, Denmark, Sweden, they could do better under a system with lower tax rates, allowing the market to step in and find better ways to provide healthcare, for example, more competitive ways to provide education, more competitive ways to provide for early childcare as people and families balance work and family life. So we understand that these problems that are trying to be solved by the welfare state are real problems that people have. But I think what economic freedom shows us is that even the best performing countries in the Nordic model, like you say, they're not socialist at all. They have large welfare states. But I think by reducing and rolling back that welfare state, they could perform even better and have more prosperity. And in fact, that economic model would be more sustainable in the long run.
Yeah, and again, they are so different. We see even how they reacted to the COVID virus, the different system. The second question is complements this one, is by Timothy Flaherty. And basically, do you think it's possible to implement some middle of the road practices that have been proposed by democratic socialists, like universal healthcare or universal basic income, without making a full transition from capitalism to a socialist economy, possible creating a sort of middle ground or middle of the road between both systems?
Yeah, Timothy, thank you. That's a great question too. And I think, what you're really asking is, what is the balance between government intervention in the economy and private ownership of the means of production? And of course, what I'd like to say to you is that I think we're already there in some ways, in the sense that, the United States and the countries that do the best in the economic freedom of the world indices are what we would call mixed economies. They're not pure capitalist economies. So there's still some level, in some cases, lots of government intervention, as you say, in healthcare and education in the United States. So I think we're living in a mixed economy. And I think that, we could potentially have more government intervention in different industries. But again, what the economist looks at is, what are the mechanisms that are going to foster greater innovation? Because greater innovation, let's just think about healthcare as an example. To me, it seems like the way we need to think about the problem is access, opportunity, and affordability, especially if we care about, healthcare for everyone, right? And people at the low end of the income distribution are who we are worried most about. Access to good doctors and medicines and medical treatments, lower prices, and better quality. That's what we want. So as an economist, I start to think about this question and I say, something's going on. And it seems to be something on the supply side, which is not allowing the same level of innovation, which, again, when you push out that supply curve, that's where you're going to get quality jumps, price decreases, all the things that we say we want. So I think we're already in the hybrid model. And what I talk about a lot with my students is that we think that, people tend to think it's all or nothing, right? Like either the government entirely manages all of economic resources, or it's just a free-for-all market economy. And I think both things scare people. I don't think the free market economy needs to scare us as much as it does. But the question is, what is the alternative institutional arrangement that we could have that would get us better in terms of prices and products and quality? To me, it's actually rolling back intervention in the economy, especially in these industries like healthcare and education, which are not growing in affordability and access the way that I think they could if we would just change the model a bit.
There are two questions. You spoke about egalitarian prosperity as a goal, and Sam asks about, is it sustainable when you have a situation like in the United States where sometimes three people having as much wealth as the bottom half? And another person asked, how, as economists, should define this democratic socialism of Scandinavia? Should it be called compassionate capitalism? I know that you use the index of economic freedom to answer that question, but it's what do you say about, are we losing this egalitarian prosperity in the United States, and the other hand, choosing the right term to define Scandinavia?
Such important topic. So, I could talk about this one kind of the 1% and the wealth holdings in the United States for a long time. I'm really interested in this idea of how inequality is changing and what are the causes of that inequality. But what I would say on its face is, if large entrepreneurs are coming up with revolutionary ideas that are changing our lives, and technology and cell phones and there's so many examples of things that, the cell phone you carry around in your pocket, I think we get to take that for granted, right? Because we live in a market economy. Just think what we're doing right now. We couldn't be in person together, but we're using all this technology, which actually scares me, right? Because I don't understand it very well, but look what it's doing for us. So these kinds of things change our lives dramatically. And so in a capitalist system, you want entrepreneurs taking big risks, making big bets on things like Zoom and Amazon and all these types of things that make our lives better. So I have no issues economically, ethically with those entrepreneurs getting very high levels of profit, because in a voluntary market, they only get rewarded with that profit if they have served not just their friends, not just their close neighbors, but served many, 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 many people. And that's what is going on. So there's a lot of this entrepreneurship that really is the source of economic growth. And we want to encourage that, right? I mean, Bill Gates a long time ago was fiddling around with an idea in his garage. That's where entrepreneurship starts, right? In people's homes and garages. And who knows what it can turn into. I think there's a downside to this inequality, though, which is what I would call cronyism. Some people call it crony capitalism. I really don't like that word. I don't like the isms very much because I think, as Alex said, this is maybe the second part of the question a little bit. But when I say the word capitalism, like I said before, defining my term is very important. But when we use that in the public square, lots of people have ideas about what capitalism is. And they tend to think, if they're skeptical, that it's really cronyism. So I think cronyism is it's a big problem, not just in the United States, in many countries, but I think it's a problem in a world where we have trillion-dollar companies, right? The problem with that is not that the company itself has made so much money or has so much value in its assets and resources, but rather that economic wealth somehow translates into political privilege, right? And so we see these companies lobbying in some cases for special interest, favors, protections, whatever it may be, that then create winners and losers, right? Voluntary market trade is winners and winners on both sides of the exchange. And so I think cronyism and rent seeking really changed the rules of the game. And so I think we need to be looking very carefully at that in the United States, and divorcing, economic capital from politics is a very hard thing to do, but that's what's going to be necessary to really stop that. And I think, again, if you're getting rich, if you're part of the 1% because you're engaging in rent seeking, we don't want to encourage that. So, to the second question that was asked, should the Nordic models be called compassionate capitalism? I'm not sure. I'm not sure I like that phrase in the sense that I think capitalism itself is compassionate. Why? Because, if we go back to Adam Smith, what he understood very well is that people are always going to be people. We're all self-interested, all prone to corruption. So he said that the key to finding a good economic system is not finding a way to transform everybody into, kind of benevolent robots, because we can't do that. And so rather we have to take people as they are. Capitalism takes people as they are with all their faults and actually induces them most of the time to think about seeking profit through service. And I would argue that that alone is compassionate. So I think the Nordic models are more, socially democratic. They have, again, these, kind of large welfare states that do provide things for people. But I think those same people could get those goods provided under a more capitalist system in those countries.
We have many questions, when you speak about cronyism, and I agree. I try to avoid the word capitalism because it has so many adjectives. I prefer the word free economy.
Yes.
And because also in cronyism, we don't have any reliable index. One of the indexes that the economists did show that the country number one in economic freedom, Hong Kong, now more than a country, a province of Communist China, appear like the most crony country in the world. And again, I think we economists would do a lot of help, to distinguish between true free economy and what you describe, the dominance of crony capitalism. Speaking about today, one question from Álvaro Iriarte from the Instituto República in Chile. How do you think that this topic that you're addressing today will be affected after the COVID-19 coronavirus crisis and the response? Do you think there will be more push for democratic or social democracy, or more redistribution, or more welfare state? Or how do you see us responding?
This is such a good question, and I guess, to be honest, I haven't entirely figured it out, because I think it could go in a couple of directions. On the one hand, I think if you look at, and we're all here from different countries and different states in the United States. So I'm in Virginia, and we've, started to release the lockdown. We've entered into new phases. And so I think what I'm witnessing is that people are ready to get back to life, although cautiously. But I think this economic lockdown had very severe consequences. And I'm not sure there'll be toleration for another one. And so to me, that suggests that people might be more skeptical of the government taking these huge sweeping reforms, their version of a reform, and interjections into the economy in the face of a pandemic. And I'm certainly not saying that we don't do anything, but I think there were other ways to do that. So I think people want to get back to work. I think you've seen that the employment numbers are already going up. I don't think that the stimulus, again, I think you could say the best of intentions were associated with that, but what we're seeing is that people who are making more money with their, basically welfare stimulus checks in the downtime now don't want to go back to work. So we've altered incentives. So that there's that at play too. If you believe that resources are infinite when it comes to the state, right? So one of the lines of argumentation is that we just need to tax, the Jeff Bezos of the world more, and then we can engage in more stimulus, and then we can slowly get back to the economy. And I think that's a mistake. I think we're going to have to pay for these policies down the road. So I'm not sure what direction we'll go in, but here's what I'm really excited, if I can use that word, optimistic about. The many regulations that have been unrolled in the face of COVID-19 bring an important question to my mind, which is that if these regulations were not important during a crisis, are they ever necessary? Are they ever necessary in the first place? So, being allowed to, even things like restaurants are allowed to sell alcohol to go, right? And they were never allowed to do that before. The size of your hand sanitizer when you enter an airplane now can be 3 times as large. So again, it's the question of if we can undo some of the regulatory regime, right? Distance learning, telehealth, the way we're engaging in education at the college level now using these types of Zoom. These are all rolling back regulations that would have prohibited that before. That's a good thing. So to the extent that those regulations remain rolled back and people see the benefits of that, that could actually undo some of the cronyism. I think one of the best ways to measure what industries are getting, kind of more ripe for cronyism is looking at the regulatory environment in those industries. And so rolling that back, I think, is a good thing for people. And if people see that, maybe we'll agitate for more of
it. And one of the speakers, one of the attendees wants to know your views about the universal basic income as a solution to go to this egalitarian prosperity, or a country with more income mobility. What do you think about universal basic income?
It's a great question. And there's, of course, so much debate about this idea, even among conservatives and libertarians. There's people on either side. Here's my response to that. On the one hand, I think I would prefer a one-time cash payment if we could legitimately do away with all other forms of transfer payments and subsidies. So if we could ascertain what that would be, and you give a cash payment, I think most economists view that the cash payment is much more efficient, right? It's one time, a year or whatever, and then, or however it's paid doesn't matter, but it's one time a year, and you can't agitate for more. Well, you could do that, then I think it would be better potentially than what we have now. But here's the problem that I worry about, is that rent seeking is always going to show its face. And so what I worry about is that people are going to then use the UBI to just agitate for growing income, bigger payouts over time. And so how do you stop it? How do you curtail it so that it only stays at the original amount? So, and then the other problem I have with it is, are we really going to be able to enact the UBI and simultaneously dismantle 60 years of the American welfare state? It seems difficult politically. I'm not sure that, again, there's the political will to do that. And there'll be a lot of people, bureaucrats who work for those institutions who, of course, will lobby very heavily against that happening. So I'm just not optimistic that the best way we could have it happen in a workable fashion would actually occur.
Thank you. And going a little bit beyond economics, I know that you know so much about other issues, within where the market operates, and some of them have to do with nationalism and totalitarianism, terrorism. Soledad Neumann from Chile, she asked, this post-pandemic scenario, do you think will exacerbate nationalism and totalitarianism, or how you see that playing?
This is something that I'm worried about, especially from the nationalism perspective. I think, especially in terms of international trade policy, I think what we're going to see, and I think will be led by American politicians, and I think that's probably true regardless of who the next president will be, just based on the rhetoric that I'm hearing so far, which is that there will be a retreat inward in terms of thinking about how do we domestically produce more. And I think that's a problem. I think that that's going to stunt economic growth, but I think nationalism will fuel that. So I do worry a bit about this. I worry about how we're going to regulate travel, how we're going to regulate even immigration in the face of a post-pandemic world. What are the constraints on that going to be? So all of these things together, I think the worries that people have about the spread of the virus, which to some extent are legitimate worries, right? But they can lead to these policies that turn nations completely inward. And I think that inwardness runs contrary to the cosmopolitan global world that actually leads to not only greater prosperity, but again, that gets us the solutions to these very problems. This is not this is not the last global crisis we're going to face. I mean, that's for sure, right? So it's one example of one. Will we have another pandemic or not? I don't know. But I am worried about the return to nationalism, the turn inward, both in terms of trade policy, immigration policy, all these types of things. So I do think it's something that we need to speak about and be, thoughtful about what is the path going forward.
I think we have more than 170 participants, and many questions. So I apologize. Some people are putting also questions in the chat room, not in the Q&A. So I might not get to all. Some are asking, what do you think about the Amazon? You mentioned Jeff Bezos of this world. Do they, the companies like that, are they hurting the small producer? Are they creating a problem? Helping concentrate wealth, or what do you think?
So maybe that question is about crowding out, right? So are the large companies, as they get bigger and bigger, are they crowding out small producers? I actually think that Amazon is such a unique example of how to think, about that question, which is that Amazon provides a platform for small third-party sellers to sell their goods and services. So rather than harming them, I think that Amazon provides a platform for them to grow their customer base and to sell to people that they wouldn't ever be able to do on their own. So I'm not so worried about, companies being large again, per se. The way economists tend to think about those questions is, what does the cost structure look like in a business or a firm? And that's really going to determine market size. I think if I'm worried about Amazon, it's more about their ability to influence political outcomes, their ability to potentially change the rules of the game to protect themselves. And so I'm much worried about the Amazons of the world doing that than I am about them crowding out smaller sellers. I actually think they have a productive way of incorporating smaller sellers and, being inclusive rather than kind of putting them all out of business.
This one I will join two questions. One from Zach Collier that you will appreciate as an educator, and connected with another one for Felipe. As an educator, what is the root cause, of the students' misunderstanding about capitalism and socialism? How and at what stage, college, high school, can this be remedied? Mm-hmm. And the other question is, Felipe, can we really impose or achieve economic liberalism, complete economic liberalism in any country? Is that a realistic?
That's a great question. Yeah, such great questions. So, again, this is anecdotal to my experience, but what do I think is the source? And I have two small children, so I will tell you that I think this starts in culture very early. The picture we paint of firms, right? And are they all driven by kind of greedy, profit-seeking people who will step on the little guy to get ahead? I mean, you see this in movies, you see this in cartoons very early. So I think there's this narrative that people are greedy and selfish all the time, And we can't certainly have those greedy, selfish people running corporations or, kind of being hedge fund managers and all this kind of stuff. So I think the narrative starts in the culture extremely early, which I think means we need to start educating and speaking to our kids in the home is where I think this can start very early. I didn't read Hayek until I was in prepping for graduate school. That to me is a tragedy. I had never been exposed to it through my econ classes. So we can do better than that. And, I'm going to try to do better than that with my own children. I think the other idea is that you have American politicians today who are painting a picture of something that's impossible. My view, at the end of my video, I say this: democratic socialism is an impossibility. Socialism, which is, again, the collective ownership of resource allocation, is always going to become more authoritarian. It's a symptom, not a bug, right? It's part of the system. And so I think what we need to do when we see young people wearing Che Guevara, faces on their T-shirts is point out that this was a ruthless dictator, not some kind of cool version of what modern, better socialism will be. And then you have American politicians, like I said, who are saying, hey, democratic socialism is a good idea. It's going to get you what you want. We need to be educated about economics, or we're never going to conquer. We're never going to win that debate. Economic reasoning very clearly cuts through that argument. And to the second question, will we ever fully achieve economic liberalism? I mean, probably not perfect economic liberalism. I think we're always going to have to engage in this battle of ideas, which is why what Acton does is so important, is that we have to engage in the battle of ideas, because there will always be people battling for power. And the way people battle for power is to promise you things that sound too good to be true, right? Look at every kind of socialist leader. That's what they do. They don't promise you the gas chamber. They don't promise you starvation. They promise you freedom from economic want. And so we have to be clear-headed, but I think engaging in culture, engaging with our children and students and beyond the classroom is absolutely going to be essential forever, right? We're never going to not have to do that. So
we only have a minute and a half left, and several questions about China. I encourage everyone to continue communicating with us, watch many of other Professors Bradley's presentations at Acton University and in other venues. Very short, you can answer perhaps in 2 words, but how would you describe China? The Chinese economy and the Chinese system. Are they capitalists? Are they chronic capitalists? Are they communists?
Yeah, so I think they are going through their industrial revolution, which is what I'm excited about. But I think that they are very much an authoritarian state that's embraced, market reforms. And what we are seeing that's happened just since 1978, this is limited economic reforms. I don't think it's good to call China a capitalist economy. It's certainly not, but they want to be a player on the world stage. And so I think that to the extent that they continue to want that, we can push for more economic freedom through trade and commerce, which is peaceful. But I mean, we're watching the Industrial Revolution live. So that's exciting, but authoritarians are going to hold on to power as long as they possibly can. So it's not over yet for China, but I think there's reasons to be cautiously optimistic about what could happen there. But it could also fail, right? So we need to watch. We need to think about how do we change behavior and incentives? How do we engage the Chinese people? I think we talk too much about the Chinese government, but there's 1.5 billion people there that are our fellow human beings. And we want to engage them in commerce because that's going to liberate them.
Well, thank you so much, Anne, and participants from all over the world. You see now why she tends to be the top-ranked professor at many of our events and conferences. So I encourage you all to keep in touch with Anne. She pays attention to faith, attention to society, attention to culture, and a great, great professor of economics. So thank you, Anne. Nice to see you again at Acton. Perhaps next year we see you live in Grand Rapids in person.
I would love that. Thank you, my friend. Thanks, Alex.
Thank you.